everyone. Thanks for being here. Janine Benyus, one of my teachers and largely considered kind of founder of contemporary modern biomimicry. She wrote the book Biomimicry, Innovation Inspired by Nature in the 90s. She's a field biologist and naturalist herself, but a great storyteller and has grown into an incredible designer. She lives in, I just looked it up, Jenny. She lives in, I think, is it Stevensville, Montana? I don't know if you're familiar, but she lives in far western Montana, kind of in just below the Bitterroot Mountains. And I was fortunate enough to spend some time with her in December. We're actually in Costa Rica together, kind of right in between our orientation sessions. And I was talking to her about this program, and she was really excited to explore this concept of the genius of place, and especially the genius of our places in Hawaii. And she was excited to meet all of you, and she still is. And so we're hoping that even though this morning doesn't look like it's going to work out, that for those who are interested, we'll have a chance to talk story. We'll set up an opportunity to talk story with Janine. And maybe I can rope in her co-founder of Biomimicry Institute and Biomimicry 3.8, Dana Baumeister, who's been another one of my teachers and dear friends and colleagues. So two amazing women who I would love for us to connect with and learn from. So I'm going to do my best to channel Janine, but I'm not nearly the kind of storyteller or expert that she is. But I think these concepts, these ideas and practices that she's really helped to steward and develop over the last 30 years or maybe even a lifetime, they're really, I think they really help us think in new ways. And it might be a way that also helps us integrate some of the different kinds of thinking or ideas that we've had about how we'd like to continue caring for our places or exploring our places. So that's what we're going to jump into today. It's meant to be a talk story, so it would have been a lot more fun for you all if you got to talk story with Janine, but you can welcome to pop in and talk story with me, interrupt at any time. I'm going to be sharing my screen just to highlight some resources, and I'll link to those resources in the recording of this. So the YouTube video with the recording, I'll make sure that those resources are linked, but you're welcome to kind of copy them down or pull them up as we go along. And that's what we're in for today. So if you have to jump out or if you're kind of just tuning out, I know Saturdays are a busy time for everyone, so don't worry about that. I'll just keep talking story. I'll invite questions if nobody's jumping in and asking them, but please feel free to just pop in and sort of share anything you're thinking about, maybe how it applies to your particular place or project, or questions that you have, clarifications that you want, or additional insight. We have so much expertise, and probably many of us are familiar with all kinds of different design practices, innovation practices, science and ecology practices. So please feel free to jump in as much as you like, and as often as you like. Does anybody, before we sort of kick off with that, does anybody have any opening kind of questions or comments, or any expressions of like, oh, we're talking about biomimicry. I'm excited about that because, does anyone have any opening thoughts?
I just wanted to say that when you were teaching the biomimicry class and sort of your intro to it, when I signed Koa up, and I know he didn't finish it, but I think one of the things that excited me the most, I guess, as a performing artist, was like just the musicality of the world around us and how that influences like how we communicate, right? How we experience joy. And yeah, the world around us is so complex and cool, and when we learn how to like go back, right? I guess in many ways to disconnect, then actually we become so much more reconnected and just in tune, right, to all of the nature that's around us. One of the things that was so cool when I was recording music with Uncle Calvin was like the microphone picked up all of the bird sounds, and I was like, wow, there's so much of it that's just like around. And yeah, I mean, I just think about, like, I'm looking outside at my bean plant, which is like totally going to seed, and like, oh well, what are we gonna do with all those beans, right? Like, or the dried beans, and like, oh well, we should make musical instruments, probably. Shakers and whatever. Anyway, that's what I have to say right now.
Oh, I love it. I love it, Melissa. That and I wasn't planning on sharing Beastbox today, but we're gonna do it because I'm like, how did I not? How is that not the opening to this? And thank you for helping me channel Janine, because if Janine were here, she'd be like, of course, that woman loves to dance and she loves to sing, and she people think she's like this very serious scientist, but really she just feels nature in her being and loves to express it and channel it. So it's really, really cool to watch her do that, watch young people do that, watch people who get it, who are still connected to that space and way of communicating. That's foundational to who we are as humans. Yeah, I love that. Kayla, what's up? What are you thinking?
I was just remembering like what I was learning, and I think it was, well, I was taking two courses at once, but one of my first courses was in biomimicry, and I got so frustrated with the actual 3D modeling. I was like, I couldn't figure out how to like do the scribble thing because it wouldn't do exactly what I wanted with like how it was supposed to be. So most of it just went into like, what are the parts of the what? Yeah, butterfly. And then it was like going into depth of what would be these things, like why would we have this in this place, what's the use of it, and like researching what would go where and why, and like finding purposes and like finding out what you can use from nature. I think it's pretty cool, and like integrating it into engineering, and I found that very fascinating when I took my first um, course in biomimicry.
Oh, Keala, thank you for sharing that. And I loved watching you because you're so artistically inclined and you're so talented. And I think, more than the CAD software frustrating you, you probably frustrated it because you were trying to make it do things that it's not capable of doing. Um, and I thought, oh, that's amazing, right? The sketches and drawings that you would do of your ideas. That's really, for me, design and innovation is a tool for deepening our thinking. It's for giving our attention and our intention to a particular question or a particular opportunity, or a particular place. So design ought to be a way that we malama, right? And innovation ought to be a way that we malama. And I think that's part of why I love biomimicry, is that it's not so much about, oh, we want to make fancy new technologies. Um, we do. That's something that the world maybe needs, is some new technologies. But I think one of the things that I think it invites us to do is, how can our technologies be better for all of us, for all of life, and help us take care of each other. And by each other, I mean all of the things in our environment. So I think that's really cool that you were able to kind of dig into that process. I remember teaching that class and thinking, this isn't about learning the CAD. It's not really necessarily learning the specifics of biomimicry, but really about learning this sort of way of thinking about the world and being in the world and connecting to the world, and just being so appreciative of life and all that life provides us and wanting to learn from that. And so I think that's, not everyone's going to want to be an engineer or a designer or spend their time in CAD software. And that's okay. Some people can make music, some people can be out exploring on the reef, some people, you know, there's all kinds of places where we can practice biomimicry. And one of the things that I hope we can talk story about today is the way that biomimicry is something that we have to do together. It's not like I'm a biomimic, so I get to do the biomimicry. Biomimicry is fundamentally a collective and collaborative enterprise and exercise. It's not something we do on our own. And so that was one of the challenges, Kayla, that I would have in the class, is that it wasn't that I wanted each student to learn everything. It's that I wanted all of us collectively together to become, you know, biomimicry, to become nature ourselves and to start kind of working with one another in interesting ways. And we did do some of that, but it's a challenging thing for humans because we've separated ourselves even from one another, not just from nature, but we see ourselves in individual terms most of the time. It makes it doing biomimicry well really challenging. So, and being a part of nature really challenging because we don't do anything by ourselves in nature. It's all connected. Kiala, what else are you thinking?
Well, like, it's another comment to like how we're learning more about nature and like what you're making this thing from. But I think it would be interesting if you could like take something from their environment, turn it into energy. Like, you know how there's solar power. So let's say you're making like a leaf something or a flower something, but they use photosynthesis to grow. So maybe using like solar power to charge that car, or like to give that car energy, or like what was the other one? Are they like
I don't know. Anti was telling me that like bees use the sun to make like minerals or get something. I think that's crazy to me. Bees use it too. Bees use the sun, just like plants use the sun to make energy.
just incorporating more nature? Because there's like one thing with like just making or taking an animal, insect, well, I don't know, just some sort of animal or plant, and then creating it into like incorporating that into some sort of new technology, but then also taking it like further and using things from nature. I feel like would be cool.
No, I love it. One of the things we'll talk a little bit about that'll be part of our talk story today too, Kayla, is um, you know, what makes something biomimicry, and then what are other ways that we use that we do innovation inspired by nature, right? And how do we actually there's a whole field called bioutilization, and it can be very important. It can also sometimes, you know, there are also some ways that people could use nature in ways that aren't that healthy or regenerative. But I think, you know, this idea that how can we incorporate more natural materials, more of actually living things into our human world, I think that's an important question. And yeah, I got a chance to visit Moku'oloi, Coconut Island, where that houses the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology on Thursday, and we were working with the Coral Resilience Lab, as formerly the Gates Lab, Ruth Gates's lab that identified the supercorals, right? The very sort of thermally resistant or resilient corals that are living in Kaneohe Bay and other parts of the Hawaiian Islands, so that they can fragment those corals and try to plant them to spread this resilient varieties of coral across more parts of the bay as it faces threat from warming. So I was out there and was just thinking about they're in the midst of really trying to reimagine their footprint. And so simultaneously, they're trying to restore natural elements, right? How can we replant native species? How can we create our sort of coastal environment so that it's friendlier to nature, that it allows kind of the coast of Moku'oloi to be, the shoreline of Moku'oloi to be useful to the organisms that should and do and would call it home if it were healthy. But then they're also using, so that's maybe bioutilization, or that's kind of this way of using nature to help improve the health of a space. But then biomimicry invites us to not really use nature, but to learn from it. So it's not that nature is a resource or that nature is going to do the work for us, which it sometimes is and can and should do, but it's that it's our teacher. And that nature can actually, we should be asking nature. And so one of the first resources I'll share today, and Keal is already familiar, I think, but it's really asking nature, what should we be doing? How should we be designing? And when we were having our conversation last Saturday, and I was just continuing to think about, yeah, what if we designed our environments based on what we can figure out the tree snails would tell us, and what we would figure out that the Aio would tell us, and that the Honu would tell us. You know what? If we could understand a little bit more what their perspective and lessons would be about how to solve some of these challenges. How are we going to cope with sea level rise? How are we going to cope with rain? How are we going to cope with drought? You know, how are we going to manage temperature? How are we going to do all these, manage salt, all these different kinds of things that nature has been doing for, life has been doing for 3.8 billion years. It's been figuring out how to do these things. And that to me is a little bit of a different relationship than how can we use nature to help us solve our problems versus how can we actually start giving the respect to nature as our teacher, as our kumu, as our source of life and source of knowledge. And then that's really interesting to me. And when I think about Ike Kopuna, so one of the things I wanted to talk story about today is when I think about the knowledge and wisdom and perspective of the ancestors, those ancestors include all of our ancestors, all of our living relatives, human and non-human. And so at a foundational level, Ike Kopuna, which is a foundation for us being able to design and innovate, this is really about treating all of life as our teachers, because as humans we haven't been around very long. One of my favorite stories that Janine talks about is, she says, you know, if we were going to fit all of life, 3.8 billion years, into 1 year, humans have only been around for the last second of that whole year, not even a full second. So humans have not even, in the 3.8 billion years that life has been around, humans are the babies. We're the most brand new species. Yeah, so we think we have it all figured out. We often view ourselves as like, oh, we're the pinnacle of living existence. We're the smartest, most intelligent things on the planet, right? But it's just like, you know, it's just like when the young kids think they know everything, and they don't want to listen to what all of their elders and more experienced people have to say, which happens sometimes, and vice versa, where happens too. But I think, how do we really tune in and start listening again? And then I remember other conversations that I've had with some of my friends from Vancouver, what's now called Vancouver Island, and they were talking about, I said, you know, wow, they talked about growing a forest. So they have this beautiful red cedar forest with trees in that forest that are over 1,000 years old in the old growth forest, that they had to fight to protect from logging companies who wanted to cut those trees down, clear cut that forest so they could sell that wood. They wanted to use nature. But they said, no, this forest has taken us thousands of years to grow. So wow, that was kind of a different way for me to think, was like, oh, biomimicry invites us to think about the lessons that come from developing things over thousands of years, not just, you know, oh, I went to some startup boot camp and now I have an innovative idea, you know, and now I'm ready to like change the world and I have some new technology. And we often do this, right? Like Elon Musk, I want to send everybody to Mars, you know, which is cool. But it's also from a living perspective, from a life perspective, 3.8 billion years perspective, it's kind of a childish thing, a babyish thing to do. Jenny, what are your thoughts?
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just thinking, I love this topic because my friend and I, we are going to Peru in October. I'm like, when is this? It's in October, and one of the things that we will be seeing there is this like bioluminescent tree called like the flying spirit. And there's only a few of them. It's way in the jungle. I'm like, where are we going? You know, we're like, Lindsay's going, just trust. I was like, okay, fine, we're just show up and she'll take us there. But we have another friend who we're going to try to stop and see in California, and we keep talking to him about going and seeing this Methuselah tree, right? But it wasn't the almost 5,000-year-old one. It was the redwood. But then that led me to looking at, like, I was like, there's this tree that's like 4,900 years old. Like, how come and it's in California? I thought I'd been everywhere in California. And so I was telling her about that, but just thinking about, I read something, I think it was maybe on the Atlantic or something like that, but it was about how all the things that have happened during just the life of that tree. And just, the pyramids were built, and, Babylon, something happened, like it was like all of these, that amount of time. And a lot of what it seems like you're talking about, there's always this like rush to do things. We got to do things like almost like behind, and, like, oh, we know so much. And yet a lot of the biomimicry and having nature be the teacher, a lot of that is slowing down and taking the time to really observe, even how the octopus teacher is appealing to people and has done really well, because he went there and he did it every single day. They're kind of like, whoa, like that's such, and I just question whether things should be more in that vein. And, maybe the idea of observation, we're only scratching the surface, and maybe there's a lot more observation in those quieter things that are needed, and not the, like, I'm going to study, I'm looking at this one thing. While you're looking at that one thing, you might literally miss the forest, right? Hearing the birds, watching where the octopus goes, or the haze, like, oh, let me show you something. And yeah, that's just what I thought of. I don't know if that helps at all, but I thought it was cool. I was like, oh yeah, you're gonna go see like almost a 5,000-year-old tree and then see another one that glows. And I will see what that teaches me. Because I'm open, and there's wisdom there on how to live for that length of time and survive fires and keep the nutrients and drought, and not getting cut down. So yeah, aside to that.
I think it's, wow, thank you, Jenny. And of course, that every time any of you jump in, it makes this conversation a million times better. So keep doing that. If you don't let me talk anymore, this conversation will probably be the best it could possibly be. So I love that. Wow. I'm just thinking, like, when I was sitting in that old growth forest and realizing that, like, from a perspective of people who have cared for that forest across generations, there's not a separation between one generation and the next. Human death, which is so hard, which is so challenging psychologically, emotionally for us, and we've largely been taught socially and culturally to feel the way that we feel about feeling like we're losing someone. But then the more I learn about, like, I'm going to Papahanaumokuakea in September, right? And I'm thinking about these ancestral spaces, and thinking about Po, and thinking about, as people transition. You guys remember I lost my sister in December, and, as a young child, I lost my mother. So, I've always had this kind of interesting relationship with passing, and thought about it a lot since a young age. But it's like for me, it's really powerful to think about us as just, we live forever, right? But we just live forever in these new forms, right? In our children and grandchildren, in our ohana, in our relationships that we have with one another, in the rest of the natural environment, because of aloha being this exchange that we have with the natural world. we are those trees. Those trees are us. You could, and it's mostly a metaphysical, spiritual thing, I think, but I don't know, because science has taught me to not think about these kinds of questions. But when you press your forehead to the tree, to the red cedar tree, you feel that there's like a real thing that a connection and a bond and a sharing, and uh, a coexistence that is actually manifested in a real kind of experience. So, you know, I like to hold the sort of metaphysical and physical, the sort of science and spiritual, at the same time, and think about them, and really think about what that can teach us. And I feel like indigenous cultures generally, many indigenous cultures that I've had the privilege of learning with and from, and especially here in Hawaii, they do that really well. And it seems to be an important part, and it seems to be a foundational part of biomimicry, even though, Janine is a white woman and a PhD and a scientist, so she often gets sort of lumped into this Western science way of being, but she is a deeply sort of spiritual and metaphysical and like nature connected. She has so many indigenous qualities about her, and I think that's, biomimicry doesn't often get appreciated for that. People want to talk about the bullet train, they want to talk about the CAD design, they want to talk about the cool new technologies being invented, but they sometimes miss this sort of what we might call kind of spiritual element. And I think Melissa kind of hinting at that too from the very beginning, that like the first way that we engage with nature is through protocol, it's through song, it's through sharing of breath, it's through a spiritual connection, and that this is our family, that these are our relatives, and understanding that, and watching like Kimiona, for example, and Waimanalo have that same relationship with rock, right, with Pohaku. Wow, that is, that's a really special, and I know Hokulea actually arrives in Papeete today. So if you didn't know that, there's a televised ceremony on va'ahunua.com or on French Polynesian TV. It's going to broadcast starts at 12:40 our time, 1 o'clock. I think Hokulea will actually arrive they have a beach in Papeete called Hokulea Beach from the 1976 arrival. They named it after Hokulea. And there will be a major ceremony, but a part of that ceremony is going to be the laying of a stone, a pohaku that was selected from Hawaii to go to Tahiti, to honor them and to share our actual aina, to share our actual land with them. So this is, to me, like, that's not, when I talk about biomimicry, I mean that as much as I mean anything else. I mean that kind of relationship, that kind of connection, that kind of worldview and ethic, this fitting into and being a part of all of this living system that we're living on. So,
Hey
yeah,
Dan,
yeah,
I was
yeah,
just
jump
gonna
in.
say, yeah, no, it's okay. I was just thinking, I've been listening, and a couple of my friends listen to, like, breeding sweetgrass with this whole ethnobotany. And I like how Robin it's a Kimner, how she, how it's both that science and that, those indigenous roots and the spiritual side of it, because, sometimes it's nice when you have both the science behind something, or some things that have been passed down, and it's like, well, that's how we've done it because that's how we've seen it's worked. And then sometimes scientists go like, oh yeah, this is the way things should be done because of X, Y, and Z, and they're like, well, we just did it because of this. Or, we like work with the sweetgrass because it actually comes back stronger, if the heat, if people are helping that along and actually, like, harvesting in there, then it allows for more growth to happen. So yeah, just your thing about that, it made me think of her.
Oh, yeah, I love bringing up, anytime anyone brings up Robin Wellcomer or Robin Mazer, I get excited. But yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass, if those of us who haven't read it, if you want to read it, or even just reading some of the articles in like Emergence magazine or some of the podcasts that she's done, or it's always a real treat and a real gift. super important perspective. There's another really cool book called Low Tech, TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, that's really kind of also, there's a lot more happening now than there has ever been before about um, how do we blend this indigenous science and so-called Western science, and how do we integrate ancestral practice with technology. I think I told you the name of our shark research project in Papahanaumokuakea is Malama Mano, integrating ancestral intelligence with AI. Yeah, so we're really trying to look at how do we understand ancestral relationship and practice with both the place and with sharks, and then how do we integrate that knowledge and that perspective into our applications of, computer programs and software and algorithms that are going to help us hopefully observe and protect and care for um, our ancestors in Papahanaumokuakea, right? And from a Hawaiian perspective, right, our literal ancestors that are swimming around out there, and from an evolutionary perspective and a Western science perspective, also our ancestors, right? Sharks have been around for, I think, on the order of like 400 million years, so much longer than humans. So super interesting to think about, like, oh, that's like tutu. Yeah, we got to listen to those stories. We got to sit down and, it's not something to be afraid of. Maybe sometimes sharks give us a scolding if we're not behaving the way we're supposed to be, or sometimes it's on accident because that's how it happens. But, it's like, oh, we gotta pay attention to the way that they're living in this world. And what would happen? I think the fundamental question for this talk story is what would change about our plans. What would change about our behavior, about our designs, about our relationships with our places if we evolve them to be rooted in the perspective of the rest of the living things, right? The sharks, right? In our environment. What would happen if we said, oh, we're going to design our environment to be really, really good for the sharks? And I contend my position on that is that it's going to be better for us too. If we create an environment for us that is also really, really good, the goal is to make it as great as we possibly can for the health of our shark populations, then I bet it's going to be better for us too. And I think it's worth, I think about the braiding sweetgrass and talking about, the wildfire, the fire management techniques of indigenous peoples, right? And looking at how they danced on the earth to prepare it, right? And they time it with the moon cycle and the salmon run, and they have everything is kind of coordinated, but it's not based on like, well, what's most convenient for us? It's based on like what's best for the salmon, what's best for the grasses, what's best for the trees, what's best for the bears, like what's best for the prairie dogs, whatever the animals are living things, plants, microorganisms that they couldn't even see yet, but they sort of knew were there because they could tell that there was like some magic happening in the soil. They were like, whoa, that's, they really, and same thing in Hawaii, right? That like we have all of these old mo'olelo and all of these like really old stories describing ecological phenomenon that were rooted in microscopic interactions, but that manifested themselves in other ways in the world, and that was a known thing, before there were ever microscopes. So I think that's pretty interesting, what happens when we can blend these perspectives. Yeah, I love it. All right, well, real quick, before anyone has another idea, I'm sure you guys have plenty you want to share, but before anyone does, I want to share Beast Box at least, because if we don't get to anything else, then I realize. So this is actually developed by a friend of mine named Ben Mirren. He was a student at Cornell, and he was studying bird sounds, and he also loves to mix music. So that was just another thing that he really loved to do. And he was doing all these cool bird recordings, as ornithologists, as bird scientists do. and he realized like, wow, this is great material. This is so musical. And so based on that sort of premise, he spent a lot of his time in his graduate program actually creating this platform. So those of us who haven't seen it, you can check it out. Basically, hopefully you all can still hear me too, but basically this is just a collection of animal sound recordings that you can now mix into different beats and tracks. So, I get to select. I get to select some creatures. I'm gonna go with ocean creatures. So I'm gonna select this. I think that's a humpback whale. Or no, that's the blue whale. I'm gonna pick this dolphin and this parrotfish. Who else we got? Oh, look at this. Yeah, there we go. Oh, here's the humpback whale.
Beast mode.
Oh, I unlocked beast mode because I picked all the animals from the Great Barrier Reef. So each of these organisms represented is also tied to a different ecosystem. All right. So I love that. I love that. So Melissa, thank you for sharing that. I think yeah, cool. I like it. I think one of the it's almost kind of a cool example of what we ended up talking about at the end of that conversation, right? Is how do we blend these kind of modern technologies, contemporary approaches, and techniques and ideas like mixing music that is also rooted in nature or is rooted in something. Animals have been singing those songs, not those songs because they're remixed for contemporary spaces, but they've been singing those songs for you know millions of years across this planet, right? And our planet has evolved to both experience, like listen to experience that sound, right? And I think about the way that whales are impacted by our shipping industry, right? And how we talk about ocean noise is such a critical issue, but we don't attend to it because we don't hear, we're not underwater trying to send messages, right? And I remember reading some interesting research a handful of years ago that said, the right whale populations in the northern Atlantic actually used to be connected across the thousands of miles between North America and Europe, that those were actually one population. But that once we started industrial shipping, right, we were actually disrupting the signals and the calls that those whales could send for hundreds of miles across the ocean. And so now those two populations, they became isolated because they couldn't hear one another, right? They couldn't hear one another anymore. So this whole family of whales that was like exchanging DNA and knowledge, right? And all this kind of experience, they were divided just because we said, oh, we need to, run our tankers and our submarines and our, ships across. And I'm not saying that global transportation and all that is a bad idea. I'm just saying I bet it would be better for us too if we designed it in a way that was better for the whales, right? So I think if it's just like the premise of human-centered design is this idea of empathy being at the core of design, right? And it's if you really try to put yourself in the shoes of the user of whatever product or process or system you're developing, then it's going to be better. Well, instead of thinking about users and only thinking about humans, I think biomimicry invites us to do this kind of like investing in empathy for all of life. There was an author named Jeremy Rifkin. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Jeremy Rifkin. He writes about economics, but kind of alternative twists on economics. I think he's an economist. and he wrote a book called The Empathic Civilization. And there's actually a great kind of RSA animated talk that Jeremy Rifkin gave, that they turned into this little animation called Empathic Civilization. And it talks about kind of the hope and progress that we've been making in extending this sense of empathy that we have to, broader and broader spectrums of life, right? And that we can really understand that actually everything deserves our care and attention. Yeah, anyway, I love that, Melissa. Thanks for reminding me about Beastbox and having us bring it up. And I'm glad we're all Beastbox fans. Ben will be excited. He's people build these really amazing tools like that, and then they kind of get passed around. But if they never go viral, right, then, and something like Beastbox is not really something designed to go viral, but if they never go viral, they just kind of live on the internet forever, or at least for a long time, in somewhat obscurity, and people then kind of forget about them. But I'm like, no, everyone should start their day like remixing animal sounds. And like, we should all do that. It'd be a great way to, oh yeah. Like someone mentioned just the bird sounds in the back, or Melissa, when you were recording Uncle Calvin. And I'll tell you what, when I'm on the phone or on a Zoom call and my door's open here, I'm at home right now, and we have, especially if it's in the morning or afternoon, we have all of those little, the rose ring parakeets, which are invasive, right? And, but people, they squawk, they make a lot of noise. Farmers, I hate them, but here in Honolulu, right, they live in there's like, I don't know, probably a few thousand of them that live in the banyan tree outside of my building. And they fly past the windows every morning, every night. And yeah, the thrushes too, we get a lot of those as well. And it's, that's what they notice. They go, oh, are those birds in the background? I go, yeah, I hate those buggers, just every night, every morning. But I realized, like, actually, no, they're doing their thing, like they're just doing their thing. And, wow, it's really beautiful. They're actually beautiful creatures. We've had one or two that kind of come into the hallway or get trapped, or we've had one on our lanai that ran into the window and had to kind of rescue it. And they're such beautiful animals, and it's not really their fault that they don't belong here, and they're just trying to survive. So it helps, I hear people say, like, and I heard myself say, like, oh, I hate that, or I hate this, like, living thing, right, that we wish wasn't here. And I'm like, it's not worth hating, right? Like, all of life is worth kind of loving and celebrating, but it's just a matter of, we haven't designed our interactions very well. We haven't designed our relationships to sort of tune in to, like, thinking about the spread of all the invasive marine organisms that have come in the ballast of ships with the global speaking again about global transportation, including a lot of algae and other things here in Hawaii. But, you think about lionfish, you think about the zebra mussels and quagga mussels that are now spread out around the world, taking over certain ecosystems. There's all these interesting examples. So, yeah. Designing with a sort of love and respect and attention, treating nature as the sort of source of knowledge and inspiration that it is. That's really at the foundation of this talk story. Yeah, Robin, I see a hand.
Did we talk about that book, Wild Souls, in this group?
No, we haven't. Let's do it now.
It's a great book. It's fairly new, and it starts out, the author is on Kauai and talking about the birds, what's happening with the birds on Kauai, which is the native birds are having a real hard time surviving because of the mosquito.
Yeah.
But the way that she goes about telling the story in her book is that animals move, and we all move across the planet. And it's something for us really to ponder and make some good choices, because, like you said, it's not the animal's fault a lot of times that they're in a certain place. And how do we deal with it? What is their impact? Can they live? Can we coexist? Can all the animals coexist with them? Or are they going to completely wipe out another species? Or what are the choices being made? And that we make, that humans make. Do we poison all the rats? Do we, there's a lot of things that are happening out there. And here in our beautiful islands, I mean, just off of Kauai, recently the island was completely covered with poison, lehua rock, in order to save the seabirds. And there was a big concern about the fish, but I think it worked out. In this case, I think it worked out for the fish, not for the rats. Yes, for the seabirds, definitely for the birds. But the book itself is really worth reading. And what I like about it is that it's not just one perspective. She really tells a lot of people's perspectives. And I think I admire that. And I think the book is worth reading for all of us in this group.
I love that recommendation. Thank you, Robin. I actually picked it up just a couple months ago because I was doing a bit of traveling, and also was thinking I was going to go on this sail to Tahiti, and so wanted to have something to read on the way down. And I'm a big I did an interesting fellowship with a group called Natural Habitat Adventures, and it was about the monarch butterfly. And I think so much about I've sort of lived this, migrating life myself, moving all over the world and traveling quite a bit, and sometimes feel a little bit guilty about like the consequences of that. And is that really a healthy way for me to design my own life? And then at the same time, so appreciative for all that's taught me, and all the ways I've been welcomed in various parts of the world, and the things that I've been taught in all of those places. And so I often sort of, and I love this journey that the humpbacks make, that the albatross make, that we sort of see, but maybe don't think too that much about. Like it always blows my mind when people don't really realize that there's like seasons for stuff, that like, oh, if you want to see the albatross chicks, you have to go at this time. If you want to see humpback whale babies, you got to go at this time, because this is the time when that happens. Even with like coral spawning, which this next new moon should be a major coral spawning event, but a lot of people don't realize that many coral species only spawn once a month, right? And that it's timed that way. And that if they wanted to go observe it, or they wanted to go sort of be a part of it, they could. But they'd have to plan around that, right? And we're so used to like, I want to book my vacation, I want to book my reservation, I want to book my thing when I'm ready to go, when it's convenient for me. And it's been really interesting conversation. This is a little bit of a detour from biomimicry, perhaps, but I've been working with a group on many of the folks who helped us with Future Navigators on the North Shore of Oahu here. Malama Loko'ea Foundation, Inui Ke'aho, another group called Mohala Farms, another group called Namea Kupono. And I was talking actually with them yesterday afternoon, because we had a school come and visit us from San Francisco. And to me, when that school asked they asked me if they could come to Hawaii, I said no. And I said, it's not my place to, I'm not going to be the one who's going to really be hosting you. And so I'm going to have to ask the community what they think. And it was that sort of Waialua, North Shore Oahu community that agreed to invite them to come. And the school now would like to come back. And so I went on yesterday afternoon to speak with them and just say, is that something that you want to do? Is that another invitation that you want to make? And of course, the school has ideas about, well, we would like to come at this time or this time. And I said, I don't want that to be the way that we approach this. So I want us to make an invitation, right? And when is the right time for them to be here? That's just so counter to the way that we've been kind of trained to think about economic transactions and relationships and service industry and all these kinds of things. And I think that, there's actually, a lot of, like, I don't know if, for example, in the days before coral spawning, I wanted to look up, does Hanauma Bay kind of shut down? Does it close itself so that those corals have a time to rest and kind of be healthy in those days before and after that event, because they're under pretty constant stress from all of the activity happening in the bay. And I don't know the answer yet, but I wanted to look it up because I thought, and it's maybe something for Anini or for Olovalu as well, is like, how do we look at those patterns of coral spawning and, you know, regenerative activity on the reef and design our policies and our practices and our systems and our products with those in mind. And rather than having those be things that we're like, those are getting in the way of us doing what we want to do, can we imagine using that knowledge and that insight to actually improve, you know, our experience as well? That actually we might actually really enjoy the space more if we designed it so that it was really good for these other elements. So yeah, super interesting. Yeah. I see a hand up. Robin, is that you?
Oops, I forgot to put it back down.
Oh, sorry. No worries.
Tom's here too.
Hey, Tom, aloha.
Well, good to see you again.
Welcome. Good to see you again. All right. Well, I'm loving this talk story. I hope you guys are having fun too. I'm gonna share a couple more resources. I mean, they're easy to find, so I don't think, you know, I'm not sharing anything that's kind of top secret. I wanted to make it things that are accessible. Those people who are on the recording, it's really easy to find this. Janine and Dana founded two organizations. One's called Biomimicry 3.8 for the 3.8 billion years that life has been around and evolving and doing all this cool research and development and wisdom development on behalf of all of life here on the planet. And they also created Biomimicry Institute, which is at biomimicry.org, and that's their nonprofit arm of the work that they do. So they have this consultancy agency and this nonprofit. They tried for a long time to be what's known as a B Corp. Many of you are probably familiar with B Corps and that this kind of idea that we want to create kind of for-profit institutions that have sort of embedded social and environmental purposes and missions. So it's kind of this blend of for-profit and nonprofit structures, but there's not really that many tax structures for those kinds of organizations. So it can be challenging at large scale to, you know, function as a B Corp, or at medium scale anyways. At large scale, you can just get a bunch of tax write-offs for various kinds of donations and programs that you run, but harder to do it at more medium scale. So anyways, they have the Institute and Biomimicry 3.8. And this is just what is Biomimicry page. And there's a couple things I wanted to highlight. I really like this part. I really like biomimicry as a practice that instills hope in situations where we feel like there's just, you know, we might look at what's the trends, we might look at the science, we might look at the IPCC reports on climate change, we might look at, you know, reports on extinction rates, all these kinds of things. We might, you know, we have issues like Red Hill, we have all these places where we're, it seems like we're not doing well. And I think a part of it relates back to what Jenny was highlighting earlier too, about this concept of time, right? Is that, you know, if we can see ourselves as part of something that's going to live on well into the future, then there is hope. And that, yeah, we might go through challenging moments and times, but that we can find our way back into right relationship. And biomimicry is really, for me, it's a practice of entering, remembering ourselves into right relationship. And to me, that's a really hopeful message. It goes through a lot of, is a cool little talk from Janine on this particular site. There's a couple of main points. I love this idea of generous design. How do we actually um, create a world that we can live in well, but that's also really generous to future generations, generous to the rest of life, and that's possible. And biomimicry helps us to do that. And then this last bit about it really changes our lens on the world. Biomimicry is about valuing nature for what we can learn, right? What we can learn, not what we get from it, not like what we can take and harvest, and uses the words extract, harvest, domesticate, but what we can learn. And then this last sentence, right? In the process, we learn about ourselves, our purpose, and our connection to each other and our home on Earth. And for me, Future Navigators is really about that. And so one of the things I hope as we think about our actions is not that we come up with an action plan that's going to solve a problem, by the end of the month. We have to like come up with an innovation and create a 3D model of it and do it. It's how do we actually see ourselves and see our connection to one another and to our places in new ways, in ways that are healthier and more regenerative. And that's really what it's about for me. A really cool website that supports sort of doing biomimicry, accept these cookies, is called asknature.org. It was developed by Biomimicry Institute. And it's really a collection of insights from various organisms. So as I scroll down, it says it's time to ask nature. You can basically ask about doing any kind of function. So all the things that nature does, right? You can ask for what are some of the organisms, plants and animals, systems that actually do that. So if we wanted to know about filtering water, we could search for that. If we wanted to know about regulating temperature, we could do that, right? And you can see some of the examples popping up there on the screen. So it's kind of like this little database of functional biological strategies that might yield some interesting design or innovation insights. And so encourage us to kind of check out Ask Nature, look through some of the collections. I love that Lehua Kamalu, who was just the first woman, right? Maybe ever. There's a very good chance that it was ever to captain and navigate a Polynesian voyaging canoe between Hawaii and Tahiti. Right? That deserves major celebration, right? This quote from Lehua. But wow, look at that, right? So, and there's a whole collection kind of rooted in that. So this is pretty special. So yeah, that's you can see this was just published, yeah, not that long ago, just over a month ago. And so you can see the connection between our ancestral practices and biomimicry kind of laid out right here. It tells a little story, and then some cool examples of how nature is connected to voyaging. And yeah, anyway, pretty cool. So if you want to check that out, I thought this collection, Navigating Deeper into Nature and Ask Nature generally, is kind of a cool resource and insight. And congratulations to Lehua. So awesome. She's an incredible captain and navigator and human being. So I'm super stoked that they've arrived safely down there. This is called the Biomimicry Design Lens, and it's a collection of tools, kind of visual tools and models that explain some of the core elements of biomimicry. And this is available for people to download and to use. It's accessible through a Creative Commons license. And I really, if you're more interested in digging deep into biomimicry, I recommend that you check it out. There are kind of three main elements or models that are created here. The first one, and this kind of just really reminds us that biomimicry is about more than just the innovation side, which might be captured under emulate, and the technology side, but that there are these other two components, ethos and reconnect, that are really about an ethic of being a part of nature, being connected to nature. And so it's fairly simple, but those are really considered from Janine's perspective and the biomimicry community's perspective. All of these essential elements are important. They're essential, right? And so you don't get biomimicry just by looking at the shape of a bird beak and then using that to come up with some cool innovation, maybe some new weapon, right, that you want to use. But that's not in the biomimicry community. That's not biomimicry because it doesn't fit the ethos. It doesn't connect us or reconnect us to nature in the ways that biomimicry invites us to. And then the other two, this one is the biomimicry thinking process. So it's a little bit of a visual guide to biomimicry thinking. I'll talk a little bit about this one because one of the ways that I think there's a connection between the story mapping that we've started to do and the biomimicry thinking process is that this scoping phase you see at the top, define, identify, integrate, that's part of that scoping phase, especially that defining of the context, right? And really integrating life's principles, which I'll show next. These are, and in some ways what you're going to do now in this next phase of like identifying and discovering and what they call abstracting, this is really what I hope Future Navigators helps us to do, right? Is that we really start going through this biomimicry thinking process. And then we've already been doing a large part of this, but we've been more focused on the scoping, and now we're kind of moving into discovering and creating. Or maybe we've done some scoping and a little bit of discovering, but now we're moving through discovering and into creating as part of this process. So when I think about what we're doing in Future Navigators, to me, it sort of directly links back to this biomimicry thinking model and process. And again, we can dig more into that if it's interesting to people, but these resources are there and available for us to look at. The third one is called Life's Principles, and these are essentially the qualities of all of life, right? These are like the deep patterns that every living thing follows and does. Around the edges of it, you have what are called Earth's operating conditions. So these are some of our parameters for life here on Earth. We're the only place where we know for sure that life exists. And we know that life has to contend with these parameters, right? We have these cyclic processes like Earth's rotation and the associated seasons as we revolve around the sun, and day and night, and the tidal changes, all these cycles that we go through on the planet. We know that there are ecological limits and boundaries. We know that things are constantly changing and in somewhat unpredictable ways, this sort of dynamic non-equilibrium. And we also know that all life has to contend with dealing with the need for water, the effects of gravity, and the effects of sunlight. So those are sort of critical elements that all of life has to evolve and adapt to. And then these are the 6 main life's principles in the green band. And within each of those, there is a breakdown of some more specific, what biomimicry practitioners call sub-life's principles. But we use these as ways to think about, well, how do we do as many of these as we can in whatever design or action or plan we're coming up with, right? How are we replicating strategies that work? How are we leveraging cyclic processes, right? How are we making sure that we're building selectively with a small subset of elements and materials, right? That we're not just resorting to using all of the man-made materials that have required a lot of heat and a lot of pressure and a lot of extraction, but that we're being really thoughtful. It's amazing that coral reefs, for example, build their entire coralline structures, right? These massive, which are essentially cement, but they're made in, the problem with cement is not so much the cement itself, it's the intensity of the process it takes to manufacture that cement. But corals build this massive, essentially cement structure at ocean temperature with dissolved minerals in the ocean water around them, right? So they just harvest those and then they build these incredible structures. But again, it takes time, right? And it goes back to this kind of this life's principle of integrating development with growth, right? Is that if you're going to build from the bottom up and you're going to build one part at a time, like those red cedar trees do, like all trees do, or that how all forests are built, then that takes thousands of years. It doesn't happen overnight. And if Hawaii is going to succeed and the Pacific is going to succeed in regenerating our ocean, then that's going to take a long time. It's going to take forever. It never goes away. It's just something that we always have to do. And we have to start remembering ourselves to that and remembering how to do that. So those are kind of these three models that are available that kind of outline some of the basics of biomimicry. They're worth digging into if you're really interested in biomimicry. And I'm going to pause there. I'm going to stop sharing and just pause there just to say, are there any reactions or thoughts to that? Any question? We got into sort of we had a really cool talk in the beginning about biomimicry at a kind of in a broad way, in a worldview kind of a way. Those are some of the specific tools and processes and understandings that biomimicry practitioners are using. If there are reactions to those or questions about those, I'm happy to dig into those now, or I can keep sharing a little bit more. Cool. All right. Well, feel free to jump in. If I can't, if you are raising your hand or you have something you want to say and I'm not acknowledging you, just say, hey, Daniel, be quiet. I'll have something to say. So yeah, feel free. This next resource I've shared before, it's called The Ultimate Guide to Genius of Place. And one of the ways that I think about future navigators and what we've been doing and what we are continuing to do is how are we understanding and cultivating, regenerating the genius of our places? Yeah, and so this concept in biomimicry is that, each of our local ecosystems, right, is filled with what we call biological champions, right? It's filled with organisms, plants, animals, microorganisms that are performing all of these really interesting interrelated functions that make a place thrive, that help everything in that place survive, right? And it's the sort of culmination of all of those different adaptations. And the thing that I think we've been adding to this concept of genius of place through Future Navigators is that the social and cultural elements of that are critical, right? And that indigenous and place-based perspectives, right, human perspectives, are valuable contributions to the genius of place. And so how do we start mapping those and understanding those dynamics and those relationships so that it serves as a foundation for our design, right? So you can see local ecosystems can inspire sustainable design solutions. My thinking with Future Navigators is that our local ecosystems and communities, right, are the inspiration for truly regenerative design solutions in our places, and that we should be designing with our places in mind, right? That they should be our teachers, that they should be our end users of our design, is that we have healthy ecosystems, we have healthy communities and people. And I think that's the genius of place is meant to be a tool to help foster that. It's a little bit underutilized, but there are a couple of examples. It goes through and describes exactly what the genius of place is, again, with a real strong focus on organisms, right, and ecological processes. And I think what we can add to that is also the mo'olelo, the stories, the indigenous science, the community insights that are also a critical part of that genius of place, and start really connecting those. And then ultimately, this is kind of where we're at now, right? Is that how can we look at what we've discovered about our community and turn the intelligence of our place, right? The real genius of our place into new actions, into design strategies. And that's what, that's what biomimicry is inviting us to do. And so hopefully some new insights come from our ecosystems and the cultural lessons that we're learning, social lessons that we're learning. So yeah, there's a whole kind of step-by-step process. One of the interesting, there's a couple of linked resources here, like the Ecology Pocket Guide. This was put together a few years ago. It really does need to be updated, but the general process kind of works. And there's also this new tool that I think I shared on Wednesday that I encourage people to look into, maybe get invited to their early release. It's called Limu, and it's an atlas of the biosphere. So it's using advanced technologies, satellite technologies, remote sensing technologies to bring the living world, the ecology, the ecosystem side of things to the surface, create a map of that, and make it all accessible online. So it's actually in some ways quite similar to what we're trying to do, just at a little bit larger and corporate scale. But I think it might become a resource that future navigators can use. And they're interested in collaborating because they're currently focused on forest, but they really want to figure out how they can do coastal and marine elements as well using similar technologies. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of genius of place supporting resource. One of the initiatives that Biomimicry 3.8 has launched in collaboration with a lot of major corporate sponsors or collaborators is called Project Positive. This is taking that idea of generous design and using it to help companies really think about how their places, their office buildings, their factories, their max clubs, the communities around those places can actually understand the function of the ecosystem that they're a part of and contribute to it appropriately. So we'll watch this little promo video. It's not very long, but it's kind of highlights what Project Positive is all about. Awesome. Yeah, I like that video, and I think for me, it's what Future Navigators is all about. But at a community scale, you can see the sort of list of there's more resources here, but you can see a kind of list of corporate sponsors, I think, down here at the bottom. So you have major companies, right? Google and Microsoft, HOK, who's who does a lot of architecture and development, including here in Hawaii, Kohler, Interface, Ford. So we've got some partners. We're trying to develop new technology port Project Positive, but I also want to see how can Project Positive be something that is not just for major corporations to do, but it's for local communities to sort of think about using as a framework for their own work. And how do we deliver this to like the various nonprofit partners that we work with in our communities, the schools? How can our schools sort of see Project Positive as something that they are committed to and invested in doing in all of their communities, that kind of a thing. So yeah, excited to kind of share that. If you hadn't heard about that before, I encourage you to sort of check out more about Project Positive. Also, if you have not heard about Donut Economics and Kate Rayworth's book that came out about 5 years ago, it's also given a TED Talk, and there's a lot of resources that have been put out about this. Kate's from the UK, but the donut, I just want to show it on the screen. Maybe if it's not going to let me shrink that down, but basically the thing that's really interesting, you talk about limits and boundaries, Earth's operating conditions. We talk about all of our ecological and social needs, right? So all of the different things that we have to provide for people and for the planet in order to thrive, and that there's this sort of band that we need to live in, right? And Kate calls it the regenerative and distributive economy, right? It's very similar to what other people describe as a natural or nature-based economy. But this donut is where we want our community to be. How are we providing housing and equity, voice, peace, education, health, water, food, and all of those sorts of things, providing a strong foundation so that all of life can thrive, and that our ecosystems are also being taken care of, that we're not polluting, that we're cycling the appropriate amount of nutrients, that we are taking care of the soil and the land, that we're taking care of our water resources, we're taking care of biodiversity, all of the other species, etc. And so it's a pretty helpful and interesting model for making decisions about, even if you just wanted to select, some of these elements of the social foundation and think about, how we can improve the delivery of those, but also keep things within, the ecological ceiling, and not cause any pollution or biodiversity loss, or making sure that we're taking care of the land. And I think those things really do go hand in hand. And this is the world that's really better for all of us. Nobody loses in this sort of, by living in this band. I think it's a space where there can still be abundance. And so we want to create demonstrations of that and models for that in our own communities. So I encourage you to kind of check that out as well. This is from the Donut Economics Action Lab, but Kate's book is also interesting, and her TED Talk is very good. Building on that sort of ecological ceiling, there's and the idea of Project Positive, Biomimicry 3.8 shares this work example. They did a project with the city of Amsterdam where they look at this notion of ecological performance standards. How much water is being filtered and cycled through a place? How much carbon is being sequestered and stored, right? What other nutrients are being cycled? How much food is being generated? And so they went through this whole process to end up coming up with this sort of local ecological goals for a bigger project that the city of Amsterdam was doing. And the report is here. So it's all about Amsterdam becoming a thriving city. And again, I just wonder, of course, this is something that Honolulu is trying to do, could try to do, but so could each of our local communities, right? How could each of our local places be thriving on these metrics of both local and global social metrics, and also local and global ecological metrics? And I think Future Navigators, this is sort of to me, another inspiration and another sort of framework that's biomimetic and helping us think about what are some of the things that might go into doing this work? And I like this little this list on the right, 8 ways to turn this city portrait into transformative action. So if you think of your story map as a portrait of your community, then what are some of the ways that you would turn that story map into transformative action, or those lessons that you learned when you were exploring your place? How could you turn those into transformative action? So yeah, welcome. Again, I'll link to this report. This is from the work that Kate Rayworth and Biomimicry 3.8 did together with a couple of other initiatives as well. Pretty exciting stuff. So this is kind of an example, I guess, of how, for me, all of what we were talking about, including some of the things that we'll talk about in the upcoming Saturdays, how those can all come together. And then this is one kind of final example, and then I'm going to be quiet and let anybody share what they want to share. But this was out of the University of Idaho's Virtual Technology and Design Lab. One of the gentlemen who's going to be speaking with us later this month, his name's John Anderson. He developed this project a handful of years ago, focused on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska and the salmon run, and integrating a biomimetic kind of genius of place perspective with AI, as well as XR, augmented reality, or really virtual reality. He created this tool called Salmon Sim. And so we're going to watch this cool video that kind of explains how Salmon Sim works. But it's a really neat project that kind of pulls a lot of that together, and could be a tool that we could sort of create in our own communities, not based on salmon, but based off of, maybe the mano, the sharks, or the honu, or the limu. And this Salmon Sim is featuring the salmon, but it actually includes the entire ecosystem. And it functions basically like an ecological model, but just displayed in sort of a video game-like environment. So have a look.
In the pristine waters of the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, the salmon run is one of the most anticipated events of the year. Millions of salmon migrate from the ocean back to the streams where they were hatched, looking for a place to spawn and pass on their offspring to the next generation. This trait, living in the ocean and feeding, then returning to fresh water to spawn, is called anadromy. After these salmon spawn, their bodies decompose, and that marks the end of their journey and life. This strategy is called simiparity, which means that the organism has one major reproductive event and then it dies. This mass decomposition of salmon in rivers provides food and nutrients for the surrounding ecosystem to grow. Sockeye salmon, or Oncorhynchus nerca, are also known as red or blueback salmon due to their different color phases during their lives. Adult sockeye in the ocean are chrome-colored with a distinctive bluish-green back and green head. When they return to the rivers, salmon want to be as colorful and noticeable as possible to attract potential mates. Both females and males turn a brilliant red, and just the males develop a humpback and massive hook jaw with protruding teeth. This is to fight for females. After the adults spawn, the fertilized salmon eggs grow in the rivers until the next spring. Baby salmon hatch and spend 1 to 3 years growing in fresh water. When they grow big enough, their bodies are ready for them to journey and transition from freshwater to saltwater. When they reach the sea, they can swim thousands of miles chasing food around the ocean. Salmon gain at least 95% of their total weight while feeding at sea. After 1 to 3 years of feeding, adults use their amazing sense of smell and swim up rivers, determined to find the exact place they hatched, in search of a mate to spread their genes. Here we focus on sockeye salmon returning to the Kenai Peninsula in south-central Alaska. The glacial Kenai River hosts sockeye salmon, as does the Clearwater Russian River, which flows into the upper Kenai River. To reach their spawning grounds, Russian River salmon have to travel over 75 miles just in the rivers alone, which takes 7 to 10 days. It is an amazing feat, these salmon runs that bring them all the way back to their home rivers. As juveniles in freshwater, salmon are preyed on by other fish because the smaller you are, the easier you are to eat. At sea, salmon have to dodge even bigger predators, like sea lions and human commercial fishing fleets. By the time they return back to the Kenai, dip nets fill the mouth of the river, as do avid sport fishermen. Once salmon hit the Russian River, they have to make it past an army of fishing hooks, bears, and one huge landscape obstacle, the Russian River Falls. Many fish die before ever leaving the ocean. Some make it almost to their spawning grounds, but run out of energy and die just beforehand. Salmon runs are literally a once-in-a-lifetime journey, with a very important mission, and there are many factors that can determine whether some salmon make it and others don't.
A little bit dry in the presentation, but pretty cool example, I think, of like how we can start to visualize our environment. I imagine the reefs at Anini and Olovalu. I imagine, the entire Ahupua'a, system, and all of the different variety of watersheds that we have here in Hawaii, kind of represented in a similar type of way, and wonder how we might engage in making decisions and plans and things like that. So for me, it's a way of taking biomimicry, integrating with some contemporary technologies, informing with kind of indigenous perspective, and being able to use as a tool, right? As an educational tool, but also as a design and innovation tool. So yeah, don't know what you guys think, but I'd love to know. So I'm going to be quiet, and I can be on until 11:30. So if we want to keep talking story until then, I'm happy to. People are like, oh, it's Saturday, we're ready to get outside. I understand that too. So yeah, any thoughts?
Koa saying, why are you laughing, Mom? I'm laughing because I guess since the moment we got on, I've sort of been like in movement the whole time between checking at home and then going back to pick them up from rehearsal and picking up lunch. And now I'm here at my own rehearsal. So it's kind of, but listening the whole time. And I guess one of the things, that's like my kilo right now is relationships, and so while you say that it might be dry and I guess, right, like we all will pick up from from everything that you share based on what our current experiences are, right? Or like whatever is most relevant to your life. I think that's what we'll all take away, right? And so I'm thinking about, just like you said, it's not just about the design aspect of it, but it's also the spiritual aspect of it as well, the relationships that exist. So I guess in some ways, right, like thinking about the characteristics of the salmon and how, and the behavior of the salmon, and how the behavior of nature can inform us about the ways that we should behave as humans, or could not has to, but could, right, and offer us some advice. And so, like even about the decomposition of the bodies, and I guess just so much of what you're talking about, even with the mano. I was reading about this young man that died in Hana. He went out fishing and by himself, and it was rough. And just like last week, 2 weeks ago, and then his sister found this spot that was the calmest spot, and then the divers came, and that's where they found the body. And right next to the body was a tiger shark. They brought the body out. But just like so much of it, and the cycle of life, and how we can accept how things are. Right now, like at this very moment, there's a major transition happening in my own family. My uncle passed last night, my mom's brother. But at the same moment, my sister is in the hospital, getting ready to have her baby. So it's right, like the how we can accept and be okay with what happens in life. I guess it sort of happened in my family because I learned this year that my middle name, which is Ku'umalialani, means my heavenly Mary, and I just realized that my great grandmother had passed maybe only 1 month before I was born. But with Lehua, she was born, and then 7 weeks later, my grandma died. So, like it's that cycle is something that I have experienced, and just not necessarily, it's not always acceptance, right? But it kind of can put you in peace, put you at peace when you realize the space that's created, right, for new life to continue. Yeah, so those are some things that have been running through my mind. And I guess this last one, right, I was walking, so I couldn't see everything, but what I could hear was a lot of that, and I think that's what I was picking up the most.
Well, like I said, I'll share the links, but thank you for sort of seeing that in your own life and reflecting that to us and sharing that with us. That's exactly it, you know. And even on a more like, you know, almost like a literal translation of the Salmon Sim lessons here, I think about the filling in, the cementing of the development of our local IA, and the devastating impact that had on our you know, ama and anai populations, which, you know, we may never understand the consequences of that, but the fact that we had this way of being in relationship with that species that actually helped regenerate so many elements of life on our island, and then in a matter of a few decades just kind of let that get cemented over. And I think you know, there's a lot of examples of that. That's not the only. You think about the wetland birds that are now coming back because more and more people are restoring the wetland environments that are critical for those birds to thrive. And there's an interrelationship and a right relationship there that I think biomimicry invites us to create. So I appreciate you highlighting that reflection of how can we see continuity and how can we create that sort of continuity of right relationship, and be generous to each other, and, you know, to the ancestors and to future generations, and see it all as, you know, just a flow, not a, you know, not a start and stop, but it's just a flow. So yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to leave you with lots of gratitude because we have rehearsal starting right now. So thank you.
Have a good rehearsal, Melissa.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
Bye.
Robin, Tom, Jenny, Keala, any closing thoughts or opening thoughts or flowing thoughts?
Thank you again for the inspiration and the information. We always enjoy what you contribute.
It's a fact. You know, it's all about inspiration, creates action.
Oh, thanks, Tom. Thanks, Robin. I appreciate you guys being here today. Hope you get out and enjoy the rest of your Saturday.
Okay, you too.
Oh, yeah. You too.
Mahalo.
Bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Okay. I'm very excited for this topic. Thanksy. I'm very excited about this topic, as my dog is kicking my head, but you can't see. But I'm really looking for this biomimicry course. I feel like with this one, like we were talking about research with the stingrays in a walleye reef, possibly.
Yep.
So maybe like doing like a little, or that'd be a huge project, and we'd have to get permission. But maybe doing more like research about the stingrays and like their behaviors and stuff, and like what time of the year do they come? Are they there year round, and like one or more of them there, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I love the idea, Keala, of you guys focusing on, you know, that the manta rays of Oluwalu and really using that as a way to understand that whole place, but kind of through that lens and thinking about them biologically and ecologically, but also culturally and spiritually. And yeah, I think I'd love to see where you guys took that, and that's super interesting to me.
I think for now, well, how much time do we have with this Canoe, Dan?
I mean, the rest of your life, forever. But we're gonna try to share in some kind of an action plan and maybe early actions if we're able to by at the end of the month. But we can keep working on the bigger vision and the bigger project for as long as it takes us.
Could I maybe like create a present? Wait. Sorry, I have like school and stuff, so I'm thinking about what a goal.
Pesky school.
Well, I have like a final project that I have to do, and I'm probably gonna have a couple when I finish my French course. And I'm probably gonna take another Purple Maya class. I don't know. I'll try to make like some sort of slideshow on and like what they do, and like summaries.
Yeah, and Antigua on the boats on Big Island, and I know she was telling me about like her friend was just there in January, March, and was saying like, oh, because we didn't see you while we were there, then we didn't get to see them. And she was going real like, there was this thing behind it. And then my friend who's fairly spiritual and works in that realm, she was like, or it was like new moon and something with the tides and went in there, in that way and stuff. So Auntie could probably talk to you a bit about, some of that.
But
and then well, yeah, Olawalu, but you're talking about general behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And then Grandpa knows the guy. Is it Hammer? Do you know him, Dan? I think he had a hand in helping to get that designation for the Mission Blue Hope. I think it's something Hammer, and I think Grandpa knows him a bit, and he has a whole website with them on there. So yeah, that could be. And Dan, like, I have a quick question that kept coming to mind with when you were talking about like Hanama Bay and whether they close and stuff. I was like interested in that too, because that is a real, whether that works or not. My dad always seems to say like, it doesn't need to be closed on a Tuesday. It needs to be closed, like 1 week or like multiple days. So but even with like Olawalu, because it was interesting when you were talking about the coral, and the coral regeneration, because I was looking, there's those coral gardeners in Tahiti, and just with, the bleaching that happened with Olawalu, that does kind of weigh on my heart, because I'm like, oh, what can you, do there? But is
they I'll introduce you to the folks at Coral Resilience Lab and Kuleana Coral that are based on Oahu, but are actually, and they have a collaboration with the with Malama Mauna Lua. So that's why I got to go out there on Thursday. But they are talking with Maui Ocean Center about doing fragmentation, like identifying corals of opportunity, doing fragmentation and trying to replant the sort of thermal resilient, so-called supercorals out in that area. And I think Olawalu would kind of be prime area for that to take place. So it's essentially what the coral gardeners are doing, right? It's growing kind of little baby corals that are sort of developed or processed from corals that have sloughed off the reef that are probably going to die and that have been identified as like being of high promise for being able to survive increasing ocean temperatures without bleaching. And so that would be, they would love to talk with you because they want to do the same kind of training I just did and with more community partners in collaboration, because they want to grow the corals and do some of the science and processing at Maui Ocean Center, but then they're going to need places where they can go out and groups they can work with and go out and actually do the outplanting. And then with the bigger conversations around creating like actual community-based management plans for the reef and ways to, like, one of the things you guys might consider is just like, well, what would it look like to really, figure out like what would be some of the first steps in figuring out how to create a more locally informed, culturally informed, scientific informed set of guidelines for use for Olovalu, and
I
that
know.
it'd be cool.
Yeah, that was almost part of like, I don't know, when you were bringing up about that with like, the coral spawning, I was like, I was almost more like, do people even know when that happens? Or almost more of like an education on it. Like, I don't know if people read any kind of signs or anything, but just more making that like awareness, that like, hey, this is going on now. And people are like, okay, what is that? And like, I had no idea, you know.
I mean, how cool would that be if there was just even like some QR codes, and it was just like, it just said, "We're making coral babies" on the sign, and it had a QR code, and then it took you to like a link that explained that like, oh, the coral spawning is happening on this time, and it gave you an update on when the new moon is, or when the reproductive cycles of the corals were for the corals that are most prevalent on Olovalu. And people just, it didn't say you can't go in or don't go in, or it just kind of let people know that it was happening, and
Yeah.
maybe gave some ideas for how to help keep that kind of the reef healthy and less stressed during those time periods. But it does not, our rules never work that well anyways, because they just disconnect people from the process, right? It's one of the inventions that humans came up with that I feel like is kind of unnatural, is that oh, from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. you can't do this or you can't do that. It's like, well, no, just have people pay attention and make good decisions about what they're going to be doing. And how do you support that? It's a much more kind of natural way. But my amazing children just got home, and they are in need of some attention. So
Go to it. Happy Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day.
yeah,
Like
get a
we
happy
said.
Mother's Day.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah, enjoy, and yeah, hopefully get to see you guys soon. And yeah, I've got children. I waited too long. I've got children getting in trouble, so
oh,
I better go. But yeah, have
Yeah.
a great Mother's Day, Cal. It's good to see you. Tell Koi I said hi, and your family.
I will. He was doing the beast box.
Nice,
So yeah,
nice.
liking it. Okay, take care. Bye.